Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perdichizzi, and thank you for joining me as always. So excited to be joined by a guest who I think came on. I think it's his third consecutive year now. Dave Richards of CBS Sports. Dave, welcome back to the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I know it's like almost an annual tradition now. My school year ends. You come on the pod. Look forward to it every year.
I'm the official first sign of summer for UP Squared. It's
Yes, absolutely.
it's
Bingo.
quite an honor. I always like talking about the rookies with you because you've done your homework, I've done my homework, and now without comparing notes before the show, we're about to talk about all these rookies, see who we agree on, see who we disagree on, how they fit in with their new teams. I especially love that we do this not only after the draft, but after minicamp and after OTAs. We really start to begin to get a sense of how these rookies are going to be utilized by their new teams, and it's not influenced by what they did in college.
Yeah, it's and I really think this draft class in particular very interesting because we had a lot of offensive skill players obviously go early in the draft. We have quarterbacks, we have a plethora of wide receivers. We don't have any maybe one particular running back or two that stand out, but then a bunch that could eventually develop into a role. And then obviously after the first tight end, a lot of wait and sees. But I think that makes for an interesting. I know most people did their rookie drafts already for dynasty leagues. Some people still have them, lingering in the summer. Some people still going to be doing startup drafts or just talking trades or even now turning their attention to redrafts. So it's always a fun conversation to kind of get other people's takes. Here at Saturday Sunday, people have heard my takes on these guys pre-draft, post-draft, landing spots. So now it's always great the summer months. I bring on people from the industry to kind of pick their brain a little bit. So let's jump right into it. And let's start at the quarterback position. Much stronger class than obviously, we sometimes see. Obviously, last year turned into a very strong class with just how great CJ Stroud was, Anthony Richardson when he played. But some thoughts on Caleb, Jaden Daniels, what you kind of envision for them year one. Maybe how high would you be looking at those guys in the dynasty landscape? Maybe to start with those two.
Well, I think it's important to just kind of pick one of the two and then go from there. And
Sure.
I'm going to pick for you, Paul. I'm going to pick Jaden Daniels because I have him higher in redraft than I do any other rookie quarterback. So I think the fit in Washington is fine. I was a huge fan of his arm. I know not everybody was because he didn't throw over the middle enough, and yet you could go on social media and there are clips of him routinely throwing over the middle. I think he can make every throw. I loved that his accuracy rate on deep ball throws was better than anybody else in the class. We know he's a dual threat guy, not necessarily the fastest or most elusive runner, but someone who will take off and will be a source of rushing yardage for as long as he possibly can. But I like that he doesn't have the type of like footwork issues or accuracy issues that a lot of other dual quarterbacks have had when they've come into the NFL. And one of my favorite things that I noticed about Daniels, because I go back and I watch a lot of film, as do you, he got better as his college career went on. If you go back and you watch him at Arizona State, you can tell he's raw. His mechanics aren't as good. Last year at LSU, his mechanics were awesome. And so as long as he's comfortable behind that offensive line in Washington, and as long as that offense doesn't put too much on his plate, I think he's going to have a pretty good year statistically. And that upside that the rushing quarterbacks have, that's really tough to ignore in redraft. And that's why I think he's going to be close to a top 12 pick among quarterbacks. Not meaning he's going to be like 12th overall in a draft, of course, meaning that, we're still talking round 9, round 10 in redraft. But in Dynasty, I think it changes a little bit because I don't know if I can count on two things from Daniels. Number one, I don't know if I can count on him rushing into year 4, year 5, year 6 of his career. I'm not sure if he can do that. And number two, I'm not sure if he can stay healthy for all that time. And so those two flaws kind of tilt me back toward Caleb Williams, who I thought was a pretty good thrower as well. Certainly has a strong arm, certainly has an accurate arm, just awesome ability to make plays. He's got great footwork too. He's got Gumby-like body control, which you kind of see with Mahomes, where like they'll bend their body. Here I am bending my body around. If you're watching it, you can see it. But I just think that he's got that pliability to his form that makes him a unique passer compared to a lot of other guys. He's great in the scramble drill. sometimes he brought that upon himself at USC. And I even saw it at Bears minicamp when I was there with him. He kind of held the ball a little bit too long. They have to work with him on that and getting the ball out a little bit quicker. Sometimes he created his own chaos, but other times he got out of it flawlessly. And he kind of loves that Superman role. And he'll run a little bit too. It's not the same type of rushing as you would expect from a Jaden Daniels, but I think he will get work at the goal line. He was pretty successful on runs near the goal line at Southern Cal last year, something along the lines of 9 of 11 on attempts from the 1 yard line. He was really good from there. I think that's something Chicago can implement in their offense. The other thing that worries me is that he wasn't a good anticipatory thrower, but I saw some anticipatory throws at minicamp. And so I think that he can get better there too. Ultimately, if I'm in a dynasty league, let's even call it a Superflex dynasty, and you've given me the 101 and I need a quarterback, I'm taking Williams over Jaden Daniels there because I think his longevity is a factor. I think he'll stay healthier and play at the level that he's at now, and maybe even a little bit better than the level he's at now for a longer period of time compared to Jaden Daniels, who might start off higher than Caleb Williams, but eventually fall below Caleb Williams because he doesn't run as much, or maybe because he takes on too many injuries.
Yeah, I think you made some great points there. I could see Caleb Williams. I think some people might be downplaying. I think he's going to run, but I run at the level like we saw Andrew Luck when he was there be a good runner, not a great runner, not a prolific runner, but be a functional runner to produce extra fantasy points. I think earlier career Dak Prescott. I think that's kind of where we maybe see Caleb Williams. He's not going to have those 80, 90-yard games like a Lamar Jackson, or I think we will see some Jaden Daniels. So I think you make a good point about that. And I'm right there with you in terms of dynasty value. If I had the 1.01 in a rookie, super flex rookie, I take Caleb. I just recently did a startup dynasty draft. Caleb went at the turn of round 1. Jaden Daniels went more late round 2. I kind of understand that. That goes into what you were talking right there. The longevity of a guy like Caleb might be higher than a guy who runs a lot like Jaden. The injury factor, a little bit obviously more exposed on those running and the frame. So I think that's what makes that difference. But I do agree with you. Redraft, Jaden would be my pick. And I do think that maybe the gap, even in dynasty, startup dynasty, should even be a little bit smaller. I agree with Caleb going first, but maybe not a full round, which is kind of what I'm seeing out there in startup dynasty drafts in terms of stuff. Because if Jaden hits and he finds a way to play healthy and not take a beating, this, like you said, that cheat code and what he could bring to the table could be a ceiling on a level of a Lamar Jackson or a Jalen Hurts. So I think it's going to be really fun to kind of watch these two to kind of see how quickly they adapt, how they develop and evolve as throwers as they transition into the NFL game. Any final thoughts on Caleb or Jaden before we take it to some other quarterbacks?
The only other thought I'll put into your head when it comes to Jalen and Jaden Daniels and his slight frame, he's not that much leaner than Bryce Young and CJ Stroud were as rookies.
Yeah.
And those guys, I think they each missed a game with a concussion, but it's not like they took a hit and were out for 6 weeks during their rookie year. So maybe there's something to it that Jane Daniels can survive, and he'll take some hits and they look bad, but if he can play through it somehow, some way, he's got that fortitude, you'll be happy as a fantasy manager.
Yeah, and some guys just know how, like I always thought Russell Wilson, when he was more of a runner, and Raymer, he was always just so smart about avoiding taking those major hits. And that's always the thing I think, we'll see. Like Jalen Hurts, reckless abandon. Josh Allen, reckless abandon. Anthony Richardson, reckless abandon. And those, we saw Richardson get hurt last year. So it's always interesting to kind of see like those bigger, more physical. Cam Newton, sometimes that doesn't mean less injuries. It's sometimes just how these quarterbacks choose the level of physicality in terms of taking on direct contact sometimes is where I think all these quarterbacks, the bigger ones, the smaller ones, they all got to try to do a little bit better job, I think, of knowing when to go down, preserving their body. Sometimes it's going to be impossible, obviously, but, we don't know how Jaden, we've seen him in college. He didn't, he played a lot of games in college. Injury wasn't a big concern, especially the last 2 years. So we'll see how that, that correlates, at the next level. Let's spin this over to the next two quarterbacks that are obviously most often discussed would be Drake May, who landed with New England, and then JJ McCarthy, who landed with Minnesota. we're probably talking more longer term value here. Obviously, in a super flex, even redraft, quarterbacks always have value. But kind of talk us through maybe that. Do you have a clear preference if you're talking about long term, more dynasty setting for McCarthy and Drake May?
Yeah, I'm going to take McCarthy. I like the situation better. I felt like he was NFL ready as far as just being a game manager goes. I don't know if he's necessarily ever. I shouldn't say ever. I don't think he can be a special quarterback right away. And that seems to be validated with the report that Sam Darnold's going to be the starter for Minnesota to begin the year. Maybe McCarthy is closer to being ready than we think. And the coaching staff just really wants to take it slow with him because they don't want to rush him and ruin him. But I thought he was a good thrower at Michigan. I know that there were times where, like the stats when he throws to his right versus his left, were way off base. Maybe there was some. I don't think there was really much in the way of like deep ball accuracy concerns or anything like that. I think his mechanics are good. I think he's tough. I think that he is probably a little bit better than Drake May because he's already got pieces of that offense around him that'll be there long term. Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, those two guys obviously are the ones that I'm thinking of, and the offensive line will be built around him. Hopefully, the coaching staff doesn't change anytime soon. They maybe have a bad year this year and they keep O'Connell so that he can further develop JJ McCarthy and that he can settle into a role where he's the main quarterback, running back. That'd be bad. The main quarterback for Minnesota and put up some solid numbers and he'll run a little bit too. But I don't see, I don't know if I see like a huge ceiling for him. Like, I don't think that he's got the same type of ceiling as Williams or Daniels, but I don't think he's got a terrible floor either. I think he can be a pretty good quarterback for our purposes for a long period of time. And that's something that's a little bit different than May, who struck me as someone who needed some help with his footwork. I think I'm in the minority on this one, Paul. I thought his mechanics weren't great, and I'm talking upper body mechanics. I know that he's got the ideal build. I know he's got a big arm. I know he's got good mobility. I think he can read the field okay, and he might have been the best anticipatory thrower in the draft. But those mechanical issues slow me down, and the landing spot slows me down. The fact that it's New England and he's not surrounded by talent like McCarthy is, and it might take New England a couple of years to get those guys around him. And you know what? They know they have time, which is why we won't see Drake May week one. I don't know when we'll see Drake May. And so with both of these quarterbacks in Dynasty, you have to have patience first and foremost. You can't, if you're in a super flex and you drafted one of these guys to be your starter week one, you're in trouble. You better go do what you can to get Sam Darnold and Jacoby Brissett or somebody better than that, an older quarterback on a team where he's, a QB3, you make a trade, something like that, because I don't think they'll be ready to go week one. And I'm not sure if they're going to be ready to go week 6, week 8, week 10. Certainly New England more so than Minnesota, I imagine, will take their time and hopefully benefit with their quarterback the same way, maybe, and this might be an extreme example in this day and age, the same way that Kansas City did by giving Patrick Mahomes literally 16 games on the sideline to Alex Smith, not playing. And then in a meaningless game, they threw him out there in week 18, the 17th game for Kansas City. I wonder if that's a possibility for one, if not both of these QBs.
Yeah, I think you make a strong argument there that these guys should wait, right? And, on my philosophy, what I've been telling my listeners here is personally, I liked the physical traits of May better, but I totally also understand, like, for me, when it comes to their dynasty value, you could play the floor versus ceiling game. If May puts it together, the upper body mechanic issues, some of the inconsistencies, I think he could be a high-end fantasy quarterback because I think his rushing capability could be somewhere on that Daniel Jones to Josh Allen range. I think he could handle that, and he has a lot more running capability than I think people realize. But on the flip side, if he doesn't put it together, I think we're talking a guy who could flame out in a couple years, where I see JJ McCarthy becoming a good starter. I just don't know if if that's what we want, good starter, I could see it. I just don't know if he has the capability or the ceiling to be a top 10 or top 12 fantasy quarterback. So it's really like, do you want the safer guy with a little bit of upside, or do you want really the boom bust guy, I think, in May, who's either going to bust, or I think if he finds a way to put it together, could be a boom. That's really the discussion I personally think with May and and JJ McCarthy, which also kind of leads me to my last quarterback question for you, Dave. Bo Nix, Michael Penix, obviously we're talking 100% here, more, dynasty, super flex type setting. I've kind of looked at them very similarly. If you need a guy right now that let's put out there, there's a strong likelihood that Nix is the guy who probably starts either from week 1 or soon thereafter. And then on the flip side, I think Panic's ceiling is higher, but we don't have no idea when we're going to see him. So how do you look at those two guys? Is it as simple as if you need somebody, go Knicks? If you could wait it out, go Panics, or are you somewhere different in that?
Well, I think it goes without saying that that's how you have to look at them, and that Bo Nix will start games for Denver before Penix does for Atlanta, unless a catastrophe happens to Kirk Cousins and Cousins is suddenly unavailable, and Penix is there, which would make the selection of Penix make a lot more sense. I'm still waiting for that pick to make sense to me, by the way, and it
It
hasn't
might not.
happened yet. And if Kirk Cousins has the financial commitment for the next 2 seasons, that means by the time Penix is 26 years old, at the earliest, he'll be starting for Atlanta. You want to talk about extreme examples of giving a quarterback time to learn the position and go through the processes that Patrick Mahomes did. That's even more extreme than anybody probably would normally think. It feels like a waste, and it's unfortunate because I think Michael Penix does have qualities that make him exciting. The fact that he is a big play hunter. I think he benefited a little bit more from his receivers than someone like Jaden Daniels did with his receivers. I think the receivers helped make Penix who he was. I kind of overlook the injuries with Penix because he's played 2 years through the injuries. There weren't medical red flags as far as we know. Certainly the Falcons didn't have one. Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken him where they took him. As for Bo Nix, I think he could be solid. This in the offense that he's in Denver, he can work in that offense, making quick decisions, throwing short and intermediate passes. Not a great receiving core around him, not a great offensive line around him, but that can be built in time. Not that I'd be excited to have him as my QB2 in a super flex league, but if I'm in a pinch this year, I really can't see a path where he's not starting early on. And if there is a path and that is what happens, then I got a feeling that somebody's going to, pay for that in Denver, not Sean Payton, but somebody else for getting a quarterback that can't be the guy that starts right away and is beat out by Jarrett Stidham or Zach Wilson. That just sounds like nightmare fuel more than anything else. But I think that Bo Nix is a serviceable starter who can give you, in a 4-point for passing touchdown league, maybe like 13 or 14 points per game. I don't know if that's necessarily what you want. It's not great. You'd want more than that, but he's going to be capable of that to begin his career, and with more talent around him and more confidence built and more experience, he could grow and develop and be a little bit better than that. By the time he's at that spot, Michael Penix might be playing. So hopefully, I think it really just comes down to what you said, Paul, which is if you need a quarterback now and you miss out on the early guys, Bo Nix is who you get. Otherwise, it's Penix.
Yeah, and that's kind of what's been my argument here since even draft weekend when they did stun us with that surprising pick, and trying to make sense of it. Still, it's hard to rationalize that anytime Cousins has a bad game. The fans are the fans. They have no attachment to Kirk Cousins. So like it's going to be a weird, it's not like they've seen him carry the team and bring him to the playoffs so it's going to be one of those things that I feel like the fans are in this weird predicament of they wanted to get behind Kirk Cousins. And now like they're also going to clamor for the 8th overall pick in the draft, who's going to probably light it up in moments playing against reserves in preseason, throwing, 60-yard bombs down the field. It's going to be a weird dynamic that they could have avoided in so many different facets, but that's another story, for another day. Let's spin this over to the running backs, because I do think the running back position, obviously after last year when you came on the show, we were talking Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs. Obviously, we do not got that kind of star power.
Nope.
So Jonathan Brooks, from all sites out there, ADP, for redraft, for dynasty leagues. He's the name that sits at the top. We also don't know, is he going to be fully ready for training camp? How do they ease him back into it? What does the backfield, workload look like early in the year? So some thoughts on Jonathan Brooks, whether as the player, as the fit, what you think about Jonathan Brooks.
What are the odds that he pulls a Brees Hall and he breezes through his rehab from a torn ACL and is ready to start making plays much sooner than anticipated? I think there's a chance of it. Let's think about it. He's got youth on his side, but he did suffer the injury in November. It's a little bit later than when Brees Hall had his. And Carolina is kind of like New England. They're not playing for the playoffs this year. They've got a brand new head coach, and they've made changes to their offense and defense to try and be a better team this year. But expectations are really low. So they're probably in no rush to shovel touches on Jonathan Brooks. Forget about the beginning of the year, maybe even all year. And that makes me a little bit apprehensive to taking him with a pick in the first 5 rounds. I think round 6 might be the earliest I'd be willing to gamble on him in redraft. And then when it comes to rookie only drafts and dynasty, you have to look beyond it, and you have to think about, all right, if he recovers like a typical running back coming off of an ACL, then he should have those same cutback skills. He should be able to make a huge impact in the passing game. His agility should be smooth. His vision, obviously, that shouldn't be affected at all. Hopefully his confidence doesn't wane because of anything that happened to his knee. And if that happens, this is a guy who's very talented. He didn't show it for very long at Texas because Texas had so many other running backs playing in front of him, namely Bijan Robinson. So there could be an opportunity that by 2025, we're talking about Jonathan Brooks as a serious breakout candidate. And that gets me excited to take him in Dynasty. Where does he land up? Maybe he's a middle of round 1 pick. You might be able to talk me into as soon as 5th overall, because in a vacuum, I'm definitely taking the first 3 receivers, and I'm definitely taking Brock Bowers ahead of Jonathan Brooks. So that would be the absolute earliest I would take him, but it depends on your needs and everything else. But I do think he's a talented running back. I do think he is the most talented running back in this draft class. He just has some hurdles that he has to overcome.
Yeah, and we're seeing guys come back quicker than ever in terms of their productivity, getting on the field, regaining that speed and explosion, their cutting ability. And Jonathan Brooks was a guy, I feel like it's a weird dynamic. While we were talking about him this year, he was in the shadows of Bijan, and then he suffers the injury. So usually, especially running backs in college, I feel like it's kind of like a building crescendo. We know they're coming usually. Running backs, we don't get too many surprise running backs who end up going really early in the NFL draft. But Jonathan Brooks was one of them, right? We didn't know much what he was. He wasn't in a lot of people's top 5 before last year's college football season started. And then he suffers the injury. It's a little bit of a weaker class. So it's going to be interesting, but I'm right there with you. I think he should be, if we're not talking super flex, he could be in the mix as early as 5, like you said, in terms of skill players, and he has a big opportunity there in Carolina. On the flip side, Trey Benson, raring to go, playing behind James Conner probably for, I would say, part of the year. What are your thoughts on Trey Benson in the dynasty setting? Would you put him far behind Jonathan Brooks? Close? Do you have another running back ahead of Trey Benson? Is he your number 2? And if not, you could go into who is.
If it's not him, it's Corum at number 2. I think I'd probably lean toward Benson with an eye toward the future. There's just so much that I wish I saw from Benson. I wish that he was a little bit more physical than the Florida State film showed. I wish he ran with a lower pad level. I wish he caught more passes. I think he can do it, but I didn't see enough of it to know if he can. What I did see is really great speed and agility for a guy with his girth. And that to me stands out as something that makes him a little bit of a unique running back. So if you take what he did in college and you can improve on the weaknesses that we saw in college ball, then we're talking about a guy who could be a feature back for Arizona as soon as he gets it. Forget about waiting for James Conner. He could potentially outplay Conner. And that's saying something because Conner has been pretty good for a long time. I look at him toward as like I think he's a round one pick. I think he's going to go kind of toward the back end of round one. I think fantasy managers will probably feel a little bit safer with guys like McConkey and Brian Thomas. And I just think that that type of role and the fact that he could have it for several years if he can just fix these issues, his physicality being one of them, I think that puts him ahead of Corum. But I do love the landing spot for Corum because he can be that physical back that can handle the punishment that Kyron Williams has sort of struggled with. Williams has had 4 lower body injuries sideline him in 3 years, and 2 of those 4 have come before the season's even started. And that's something that I'm sure weighs on the mind of the Rams, who they're trying to win games. They're not trying to help us win fantasy titles. So if they've got a running back that they view as being an equal to Kyron Williams, and that's what it sounded like after the draft, then that's going to be a player who's going to work for them. And apparently he understands the offense already. He's had a good mini camp. I am sure there will be highlights from the preseason on Blake Corum doing his thing. And he's got that physicality, not to mention the experience that Benson doesn't quite show. And I think in that offense, I think Corum can put up some good numbers. So it's close between those two. And if you were to tell me that you like Corum better than Benson, I wouldn't bat an eyelash at you, Paul. I'd say, okay, I get that because Corum for the last 2 years has been a touchdown churning machine for the Michigan Wolverines and should be able to at least still have that physical presence help him at the pro level.
Yeah, Corum is fascinating because you could really make the case that besides receiving ability, which favors Kyron Williams, every other trait and characteristic Blake Corum is better at possibly than Kyron Williams. Now, that doesn't mean we saw Kyron Williams be unbelievable. So if we're just talking like he's obviously evolved and grown probably as a player since he got into the NFL. But if you're just like going down like a checklist of traits, you can make the case Blake Corum checks off the box ahead of Kyron Williams at every other trait except receiving ability. So it's going to be fascinating to kind of see. We know Sean McAvey likes to have that one bell cow, but I am curious to wonder if, as Kyron Williams broke down, if he saw the need to maybe understand that maybe Kyron can't handle this. We need more of an even split. Because if that's the case, Corum might even be undervalued in some spots if he's already going to work his way into a maybe closer to a committee 50-50 with the upside of if Kyron Williams goes down, being a legitimate league winner, top 10 type back. So it's going to be Corum's one of those things. I think it surprised us when he was first taken, but then the more you really dug into it, it's what they like in a running back. It's why Kyron Williams thrived. But you could also make the case that he might just be flat out more talented. Kyron Williams would be a guy in Dynasty that I'd be scared to have, but I'd also be scared to trade away because if he is the guy we saw last year, then you're trading away a really high-end running back for maybe a couple years. But I could see a scenario where Corum really eats into that. And that's, I think, one of the big storylines at the running back position, just how quickly. And I think you could also kind of say, the similar ideas with Marshawn Lloyd in Green Bay. That Josh Jacobs contract, a little phony. And if people didn't examine it as closely as maybe they heard it and just kind of put it to the back burner because some running backs did get paid in free agency this year, right? Like we saw Saquon. But they could get out of it. If you go to any of those sites like Spot Track or whatever, it says right after app can get out after 1 year for not a lot of dead money. So like that, thoughts on Lloyd, how it impacts Josh Jacobs, and that Green Bay backfield.
So I'm a Jacobs fan, and I love the landing spot of Jacobs in Green Bay. But if he just has a so-so year and doesn't really have the type of year that he did when he was in a contract season, this is 2 years ago, then I think there's absolutely a chance that Marshawn Lloyd can be given the opportunity to take over. He only had 291 career carries. You remember, he bounced around a little bit. He was at 2 different USCs. First, he was at South Carolina. Then he went to Southern Cal. He worked alongside Caleb Williams there. He's got great cutting ability. His overall agility is really good. He's a little bit more slippery than you would expect for a guy his size. He's about 220 pounds. And like Benson, there's not a lot of film on him catching the football, but at the Senior Bowl, he did a really good job catching passes downfield. Where I get a little nervous about Lloyd is his acceleration. I think it takes him a while to get to his top speed. That's going to make him easy to catch from behind. I would expect a 220 pounder to plow through tackles a lot more than what Lloyd showed at Southern Cal. And he's also missed parts of each of 4 college seasons due to injury. So there's a little bit of availability that comes along with it. I think he's going to end up being a part-time back almost regardless of what the situation is with the Packers. So even if Green Bay were to move on from Josh Jacobs after this year, like you're suggesting they might, someone else will be there to work with Marshawn Lloyd. I don't know if he'll ever be a feature back for more than, maybe Jacobs is gone, week 6, he's hurt. So Lloyd just fills the role and, he's fantasy greatness then, but they'll be hesitant to give him that role and reduce somebody else. Maybe at best he's a 1A, Paul, where he 15 carries and 1 or 2 catches a game, but he's got someone else working with him getting in that 8 to 12 range that we see so often from other teams in the league with their running backs.
Yeah, we've seen Green Bay. They like to, we always wanted Aaron Jones to get more touches, and they always kind of wanted to keep it at bay and use that committee approach. It'll be interesting to see how much they want to feed Jacobs this year. Maybe that even tells us, like, if they are like, oh, we're going to only have him for 1 year, let's just run him in, or are they looking more long-term? It'll be, we'll get a quick idea of how they want to incorporate him. Is it going to be more of a bell cow? Is it going to be more of a committee approach? Dave, I do want to leave time for some wide receiver talk, but one last running back question. Sure. We hit on the day one and the day 2 guys, no day 1 guys. We hit on the day 2 guys. That day 3 mix had a lot of interesting names, interesting landing spots. I know the one next in most rankings is Jalen Wright to Miami, but of the day 3 backs, whether it's Wright, Tyrone Tracy to the Giants, Kamani Vidal to the Chargers, Ray Davis, Buffalo, Audric Estime, Denver, list goes on. Bucky Irvin, Will Shipley, Isaac Guerendo. Is there one on that list that you are most intrigued with, find yourself grabbing late in rookie drafts, that you just keep coming up to him in the 3rd round or something, and you say, I keep taking them? Is there somebody from that list of the day 3 running backs that intrigues you the most?
Yeah, you mentioned him, and it's Isaac Guerendo going to San Francisco. And you can go wrong drafting 49ers running backs in Dynasty. Okay, everybody that had Jordan Mason knows that. But he's got some speed, and he's a good one-cut runner. And I think he's got a little bit of size to him. Maybe he can develop there a little bit more. That's somebody that I would tell people round 3 is the perfect time. Or maybe, like, I'm in a 14-team Dynasty league, Paul. I took Guerendo in late round 2. I couldn't help myself. I really wanted to have him. So in that type of format where that Christian McCaffrey isn't going to last forever and Guerendo should be on that team for at least 3 years, hopefully he shows him something and he could end up being the guy who replaces him. And he was a part-time back at Louisville. Plenty of tread left on that tire, especially if he begins his career watching Christian McCaffrey instead of playing on Sundays.
Yeah, I really like the Guerendo call because he was a guy that I had him, I think, 8 in my pre-draft rankings just on film evals, ahead of guys like Estime, Braylon Allen, Bucky Irving, and I was a little higher on him than most because he didn't have that huge body of work. But some of the skill sets and traits that you just talked about really intrigued me about him. And then he lands in that system and that scheme. It's going to be really interesting to kind of see how quickly, I know the report in the last 24 hours about maybe McCaffrey getting a little less work. I'll believe it. I won't believe it until I see it type of thing, but it'll be interesting.
You want to know what work he's going to lose, Paul? It's 2nd and 12.
Yes.
And they want to bring on somebody else, or maybe it's the 4th quarter and the 49ers are up 34-13 because McCaffrey's already scored 3 touchdowns. That's when you'll see Elijah Mitchell on the field. Do you really think they're going to take him off the field in the red zone?
No.
On 3rd downs?
No chance.
Come on.
They're going to pick and choose their spots. And, as someone who lives in New York and watches the Knicks, they never pick and choose their spots of when they get the starters out of the games in the Knicks games with Thibodeau. It's Tibbs as the coach. But yes, I think you're right. They're gonna pick and choose their spots of when to get McCaffrey off, and it'll be interesting, especially late in the game, like you talked about. If it's 34-13, I'm gonna be excited to kind of see Guerendo go on there. For people who love like the wackiness that is preseason DFS, I could totally see Isaac Guerendo having a couple big runs in preseason games that impact DFS contests and people get excited about him because he does have that big playability. And like you said, we're not going to see McCaffrey in the preseason. They're probably not going to want to run Elijah Mitchell too much in the preseason because he
Correct.
gets hurt a lot. So we're probably going to see a lot of Isaac Orendo in the preseason that might generate a little bit buzz. But I do like those traits. I really like that call. Let's take this over to the wide receivers, talk about them for maybe 5-10 minutes. Let's start with the top. Harrison, Neighbors, Odunze. It's the way they came off the board. Is it the way you see it for redraft this year? Is it the way you see it for dynasty? How close do you see them maybe in big picture dynasty? Obviously, we know that Odunze's obviously going to be third in redraft for people because of the landing spot with 2 other established receivers there. But is that how you envision it for redraft and for dynasty?
I do have Ladd McConkey over Odunze in PPR redraft.
Okay.
I'm looking to see if I've got another rookie receiver. I have Worthy ahead of Odunze. I've got Coleman ahead of Odunze, but it's only for redraft. It's only for 1 year, so don't panic and freak out about it. Listen, Rome Odunze is sharing the field with 2 other wideouts in Chicago, but Harrison's number 1. Neighbors is number 2. They're both really special for reasons you already know. I'll be brief on them because I assume your audience knows a lot about these guys. With Harrison, the fact that he was able to put up 2 huge years with 2 very different quarterbacks at Ohio State stood out to me immensely. And now he's going to play with Kyler Murray, very good quarterback. Murray has over-targeted his number 1 receiver in the past. 8 to 10 targets per game for Marvin Harrison, which is why he's my wide receiver 9 in redraft, which is why he's the 101, potentially even in Superflex. If you've got the 101 in Superflex and you're happy with your quarterbacks, take Harrison because he should be an absolute monster for fantasy purposes for years to come. And I think Neighbors will be too. And when Neighbors first got drafted by the Giants, I thought to myself, it's a total waste. The quarterback situation stinks for the Giants and they might have a huge coaching change. I wonder if out of self-preservation, the Giants lean more on Neighbors. And the door's open for them to do it because Saquon's not there, so they might not be obligated to force feed the ball on the ground. And Waller retired, and the rest of the receivers there, they're good contributors, but they're not number 1 guys. And Brian Daboll's a smart dude. He knows that he's got to get the ball in the hands of his playmakers. Did it in Buffalo. I think he's going to do it in New York. So even though Daniel Jones and Drew Lock are the quarterbacks there, I think we're going to see some pretty strong target volume for Malik Neighbors. And the way that he accelerates in an instant, Paul, it wouldn't surprise me if he had some of the best efficiency metrics among all wide receivers this year. I think he's a top 60 pick in redraft. Wouldn't surprise me if we were talking about him as a late round 4 pick by the time we get to September. And one of the things that I've always known this about Daniel Jones, but we've never could really see it. When he's got time, and this is the case for every quarterback, right? When he's got time, he can make good throws. He can throw with accuracy. He was a great deep ball thrower once upon a time. Maybe those things come back to him with that offensive line being stronger in New York this year. And instead of trying to spread the ball around like they have in the past, maybe New York just floods targets to Neighbors as best as they can and let the kid make plays. So I'm excited about his long-term future. I think Harrison is a better bet and a safer bet, but those are the top 2 for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I think we're going to see Neighbors, like you said. I think Daboll coaching for his job, Daniel Jones playing for his starting career, obviously, I think, and I think they're going to understand that they're going to feed Neighbors. Like we're going to see numbers that I think in terms of this targets and opportunities up there with as high as we've seen rookie, I think, because he's going to be the focal point and they're going to get him on a lot of the short stuff and the quick stuff to get the ball in his hands. But then, as you said, if that line could be a little bit better, I think Jones knows his long-term outlook as a quarterback is only going to be a positive if he starts pushing the ball a little bit more vertically down the field, like he's shown in glimpses here or there. And Neighbors could also then, be a part of that. And then you could really be talking about, potentially a high-end year. You mentioned for redraft having Ladd McConkey and Xavier Worthy a little bit higher than Rome Odunze. The conversation I've been having here is I think for Dynasty, ranking that Worthy, McConkey, Brian Thomas, Keon Coleman group, I could really see people making arguments for having them any which way, and I could kind of understand the person's rationale. How do you kind of look at those guys? I know you said Worthy, McConkey, and Coleman were ahead of Rome for redraft, but if you take Rome out for a second, because I think we know in Dynasty he would be ahead of those guys.
Of course.
Worthy, Ladd, Thomas, Coleman. How do you kind of see them? Do you have a clear one or two for Dynasty? These would be the guys I'd be targeting. Maybe their ceiling's higher, or longevity, or quarterback play. Who are the guys from that?
You literally just gave out my rankings for me. I've got Worthy first,
Okay.
McConkey, Thomas, and Coleman. And that's full PPR. And then there are no receivers, sneaking in that group. That's the next four after the first three for me. Worthy stands out to me. I know he's lean and everyone kind of thinks of him as, well, he's just a big play threat. No, he ran a bunch of routes at Texas. He led Texas in receiving 3 straight years. So I think that there's a lot of talent to him. I'm a little disappointed that minicamp reports weren't, glowing for Worthy, but there's going to come a time where he's catching plenty of targets from Patrick Mahomes and he'll have awesome efficiency. He's worth that risk. It's the landing spot. It's the quarterback. It's the talent. And yeah, it's the speed. That's got to be a role too. But the fact that he's more than just a one-trick pony makes me excited about Xavier Worthy as the top guy. I think McConkey's going to get fed targets right from the jump. His route running, his whole career, but certainly at the Senior Bowl, that was my first real major exposure to McConkey. He was uncoverable. Now, where I think he loses is with physicality. I don't know if he's going to be able to power through, being jostled by defensive backs. What happens if there's a 50-50 ball? He might lose those passes. But if his job is, you're going to get open over the middle of the field, sometimes we'll do a double move and you'll work down the perimeter, get open and catch the ball. If he's got space, he's catching the ball. He doesn't have bad hands and he has good speed. I just wish he had a little bit more bulk to him. And I wish he played a little bit tougher. To that regard, I thought Pearsall was a little bit more physical than McConkey at the Senior Bowl. Thomas is next, and that's more of an upside play. Obviously, the height and the speed is great, but he doesn't have that same versatility that I talked about with Ward. I think he can run 3 or 4 routes really well. I think he needs work on the rest of it. I think the Jaguars are going to try and give it to him, though. And if he can really learn it and maybe add a little bit of mass, it's going to be tough to do. I know he's talked about adding mass his entire career. His father, once upon a time, called him frail. If he can somehow overcome that and be a little bit more physical, run his routes a little bit crisper, yeah, he can be great. But it's hard to stop on a dime when you're 6'4". And then Keon Coleman, speaking of big guys, also somebody that has a hard time stopping on a dime, and also not somebody as fast as the other receivers that we're talking about. He's more of a power forward. He's one of those guys that can win those 50-50 balls. And he's going to need to, because he's not going to be able to outrun or out smooth a route over a defensive back. And I wonder about how he can translate that into the NFL. There aren't a ton of receivers who are big and physical and win that way, who go on to have huge careers. They come along, but usually they're really special route runners, or they're really, really fast somehow. And I don't know if Coleman has that to him. I know that he's had some prolific numbers both at Michigan State and Florida State, and that's worth counting. And that's worth saying, hey, this is a good thing. Here's another receiver, 2 different offenses, 2 different quarterbacks. Look how he did. I wonder if, short of Buffalo force feeding him targets to the tune of, what Michael Pittman was getting, I don't know if he's ever going to be a great fantasy receiver, but he can be a good fantasy receiver. And he's last on the list of this 4 for me.
Yeah, that's my order as well. So I agree with almost all your takes there in terms
now
of
I feel good.
The ranking of them. Two quick hitters here to end the show.
Sure.
If we found out right now, live on air, that Brandon Ayuk was traded, where would Ricky Purcell go in that last 4? I'm going to put you on the spot here. Do you have a gut off the cuff? If we found out live right now, Brandon Ayuk was traded, would Ricky Purcell go after Keon Coleman, or would he slide in somewhere else in that list of 4?
Paul, I'd be tempted to put him ahead of McConkey.
Okay.
Because now we're talking about a guy who's he's a great route runner like McConkey, but he's a little bit bigger and he can play with a little bit more physicality. And he's in an offense that's already very established as being awesome in terms of efficiency for wide receivers. And I'll do you one better. If the 49ers were to trade Debo and sign Ayuk, I think I still might put Pearsall there. I might put him behind McConkey, but it's going to be real close. But anybody who's in that offense and can run routes and get open and make plays after the catch, that's somebody that I'm going to want to have on my fantasy team. And
Yeah, I'm
Pearsall
right there
will
with you. That
eventually
would be
be in
my
that role,
yeah.
but we need it to happen. And I don't know if it's going to happen at all at 2024. So when you draft him in Dynasty, you theoretically lose a year at least.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's where, I've had this conversation as well. I would put him ahead of Coleman and Thomas, and I wrestled with the before or after McConkey would be where I would place him as well. Last question on the wide receivers. And I have flip-flopped these guys. I have debated these guys. 2 second-round wide receivers. I kind of call this the Drake May, JJ McCarthy conversation of wide receivers. I think there's a floor and a ceiling. A.D. Mitchell with the Colts, Jalen Polk of New England. I think one guy's going to get thrusted with opportunity in a bad offense. A.D. Mitchell, all his talent, was supposed to be round 1 guy, fell pretty far to mid or late round 2. A lot of upside there. You got a running quarterback, good running back. Michael Pittman's there. Josh Downs was pretty solid. How do you rank those 2 in Dynasty? Is it simple as if you want the floor, go, Jalen Polk? If you want the ceiling, go A.D. Mitchell? Or do you have a clear guy? This is the guy I'd prefer.
See, I think the ceiling is with Polk and not Mitchell.
Okay.
Because Mitchell, we know that Pittman just signed a contract extension. For Mitchell to try and have a huge ceiling, he's going to have to outperform Pittman. He's going to have to relegate Michael Pittman into a smaller role, and he's going to have to do that in an offense that's interested in running the football a lot. And it's not going to be just with young Jonathan Taylor, but also with young Anthony Richardson. So I'm nervous about that, but I still have Mitchell higher than Polk. But I think it's almost because you can get away with that on draft day.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have Polk ranked lower and you're wrestling between those two, and someone comes at you with a trade, move back 3 spots, you pick up a pick later on or a pick next year. Okay, cool. You should still be able to get one of those 2. Now, in a vacuum, I do have Mitchell ranked higher because I think that he reminded me of Nico Collins. I think he's physical. Obviously, the speed is there. And maybe he can be a better version of Nico Collins, which sounds crazy to say, but Nico really has only had 1 great year. Polk was overshadowed in Washington. Is he really about to break out on his own and be the number 1 receiver for New England for years to come? I think it's probably more likely that he'll be in the same kind of role that Mitchell's in, which is number 2 receiver in an offense that probably is maybe they'll be a little bit more prolific passing, but eventually New England will find a number 1 wide receiver who's an alpha for them, and his name will not be Jalen Polk. And so I'm not in love with either guy. We're talking round 2 for both of them. But Mitchell over Polk, very close between them. I do have them ranked back to back among receivers.
Yeah, Polk has been the guy who I've been surprised has fallen as far as he has in my rookie drafts. And then Mitchell, I think you made the perfect case with Polk, though, is next year, New England's basically, I think, going to be Carolina. Next year, they're going to have to do everything in their power to bring more weapons in to surround Drake May with a better supporting cast, just like Carolina's trying to do with Bryce Young. So what I've been saying is I don't think this year is his rookie year. New England's offense is probably going to struggle. I don't think Jalen Polk's going to be the number 1 wide receiver next year, whether they invest a top 5 pick, top 10 pick, whether they invest in a high price free agent like a T Higgins or somebody like that. I don't think Jalen Polk's skill set or college production scream out alpha wide receiver 1. I think it's more wide receiver 2. Which is why I agree with you. I have A.D. Mitchell ahead of Polk for the film eval, just a trait base, and we'll see how that comes along. Dave, thank you so much. Always enjoy talking rookies with you, and like you said, kind of kick off the summer for me as well. Let my audience, I'm sure most of them, follow you guys over at CBS, but make sure, let them know where they can find you. If you guys are working on anything in particular you want to share over there, please do so.
So most people can't get enough fantasy football. And so on top of watching your show on YouTube and listening on their podcast, you can do the same with ours. It's called Fantasy Football Today. We're live as many as 5 days a week during the off season. And then once training camp opens, it will be a daily show that you can watch live with us, usually around 10 o'clock Eastern time on YouTube. But you could also just download it and listen to it whenever you want. It's your world. You have our show the way you want it. We like to be interactive. We like to have fun. We like to help people win their fantasy football leagues. And coming this fall, Paul, we will be on CBS Sports Network. That's cable TV. Yeah, you get the channel. You just haven't watched anything on it, but you will. Fantasy Football Today will be on CBS Sports Network multiple times a week in the fall. More information on that on our show, Fantasy Football Today, which you can like and subscribe to on YouTube.
Guys, make sure you're checking out Dave and all the great guys over there. Their chemistry is arguably as good as anybody in the business. Great entertainment value, great fantasy value to help you become a smarter and better fantasy player. So check it all out. So on behalf of Dave, on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nakano, and myself, thank you for joining us. And we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.